There is no evidence of the Trinity in the Old Testament. Really? Well, explain this.
All right, let's see it.
There's this fellow called the Angel of the Lord that keeps showing up. And every time he shows up, he keeps taking the names, the honors, the attributes, and does the actions that only God does.
So this content creator has rather unknowingly stumbled upon what I believe to be the conceptual taproot of the Trinity. Now, I have published a peer-reviewed paper and a peer-reviewed book on this, and I have 2 more peer-reviewed papers coming out in edited volumes in 2026 that carry on this line of argumentation. But in this video, I'm going to discuss how the messenger of Adonai is an entity who can speak with God's authority and in God's name, and can even bear God's presence and be identified as God, all while not being God and without having anything whatsoever to do with the concept of the Trinity, which is the notion of 3 co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial persons who simultaneously occupy the single essence or being or substance of the one God of Israel. That conceptual package didn't exist in any way, shape, or form whatsoever until at the very earliest, the late 2nd century CE. So it obviously has nothing to do with any text that appears in the Hebrew Bible. And I'm going to talk about why this content creator has confused what is in the Hebrew Bible for the later developed concept of the Trinity.
Now, before we move forward, I need you to get the picture of an angel out of your head, okay? This word means messenger. It was a translation error. So the original Hebrew word, malach, which is messenger, when translated to Greek, it's just angelos. When translated to Latin, they used a transliteration. Because of that, when it was translated to English, they used the word angel. So from now on, whenever you read angel of the Lord, just read messenger of the Lord, just like that.
So this content creator is quite accurate to point out that when we translate this angel, we're importing theological presuppositions that are not actually evident in the text themselves, because the word malach and the Greek word angelos just mean messenger. Now, there is a notion of a divine messenger that develops within the Hebrew Bible and further develops in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature and into the New Testament. So it's not entirely coming out of left field, but it is an importation of a theological concept that developed after many of these texts had been composed. Unfortunately, this content creator doesn't realize they're doing a more severe and extreme example of that when they think of the messenger of Adonai as, in some sense, reflecting the later developed theological concept of the Trinity.
This isn't just some lesser being we're dealing with here. In Judges 13:3, he's worshipped. In Genesis 48:15, he's called the Redeemer from all evil.
Now, here's an issue. It is important to point out that Genesis 48 never refers to the Malach Adonai, the messenger of the Lord, or the messenger of God. This is just a poetic couplet that refers to God in one couplet and then just refers to a messenger in the next. So this is not an instance of the messenger of Adonai. This is just the poetry of Genesis 48 referring to God as a malach, as a messenger.
This is the one that blew my mind. Exodus 23 not only says to obey his voice, but also says that this angel of the Lord has the power to forgive sins.
So 2 things here. First, as with Genesis 48, there is no reference to the Malach Adonai or Malach Elohim or even Malach Elohim here. It just has God saying, I'm going to send a messenger before you. Now, unlike Genesis 48, this does seem to be referring to the Malach Adonai. Genesis 48 is referring directly to God as a messenger. Here, God is referring to a separate being as a messenger, but goes on to explain that this messenger does not have to forgive your sins. And the Hebrew of that clause is identical to the exact same statement that Joshua makes at the end of the book of Joshua in saying that Adonai is a jealous God. He does not have to forgive your sins or transgressions, really, in the Hebrew. But the other issue here is that this content creator doesn't finish the sentence, because the end of the verse explains precisely how it can be that this malach, this messenger, can do the things that only God is supposed to do. That last clause says, for my name is in him. So there's an explanation for how the messenger can do these things that only God is supposed to be able to do. And the explanation is not that the messenger is another consubstantial, co-equal, and co-eternal person of the one substance being or essence of the one God of Israel. The explanation is that my name is in him. In other words, the name here is functioning as a communicable vehicle of divine agency, and the authorized possessor or bearer of the divine name can speak on behalf of God, can speak as God, can bear God's presence. These are all things that divine images do. And so this passage in Exodus 23, verses 20 and 21, is really explaining that the messenger is basically a divine image for God, a living, breathing, animated divine image, which is actually not unusual for this time and place, because in Egypt and Mesopotamia and elsewhere, they talked about certain very special people, usually a king, as the divine image of a God that they represented. So this fits well into the theological ritual environments of ancient Southwest Asia. And there is an explanation for exactly what's going on here, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the Trinity. The angel, the messenger, is able to do all these things because my name is in him. And a tradition developed within Greco-Roman period Judaism that continues into Rabbinic Judaism and into Christianity about a special divine intermediary who had God's name in them, and so as a result could exercise divine authority, divine prerogatives, could be identified as God while not being God. And a really good example is a story where a Rav Idit has a certain heretic come up to him and say, hey, what's going on in this passage in Exodus where Adonai tells Moses, come up to Adonai? Shouldn't Adonai say, come up to me? And Rav Idit says, no, that's not Adonai that Moses is to go up to. It's Metatron. And that's because his name is similar to the name of his master. And then what does Rav Idit quote? My name is in him, Exodus 23:21. So this tradition is quite richly attested in Greco-Roman period Judaism, in Rabbinic Judaism, and in the New Testament. We have this idea of Jesus as a name bearer, particularly if you look in places like the Gospel of John, where he repeatedly identifies himself with the divine name, not because of the Trinity, which didn't exist yet, but because this idea of a mediator figure being authorized to do God's work, to function as God would function, and even to identify with God, that tradition had long been in circulation. There were texts that had talked about this already, and we're really just consolidating in the person of Jesus all these different modes of divine intermediation. That's what's going on here.
So every time this messenger of the Lord arrives, the characters seem to start interacting with this messenger and reacting as if they are interacting and reacting directly to God. And then on top of that, this messenger will begin to talk as if he is God.
Yes, and the reason for this is that these originally were stories about people interacting directly with God, the very God of Israel. Somewhere along the way, an editor, a redactor, somebody wrote in the word malach in a few places, not in every place, sometimes only in one place, in order to muddy the waters regarding the identity of the divine figure that humans are directly interacting with. And so, for instance, in Exodus 3:2, it says, the messenger of Adonai appeared to Moses in a flame of fire in the midst of the burning bush. And then Moses speaks with this entity that is in the flame of fire in the midst of the burning bush. And that entity goes on to say, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now, if you just took out the one word malach from verse 2, you just have a regular old story of God visiting Moses, as other parts of the Pentateuch explain that God did. And if we look in the Latin Vulgate and in Josephus' retelling of this story, there's no messenger. According to the Latin Vulgate, it was God themselves who appeared to Moses in the flame of fire in the midst of the burning bush. And we have examples of this elsewhere in Genesis 16, in Genesis 22, in Exodus 3, in Judges 2, in Judges 6, in Judges 13, where we have this conflation of identities where the messenger is doing things that messengers don't do in this time and place. And the people the messenger is interacting with think they're talking directly to God, and the messenger speaks as God. And all of it can be reduced to the textual interpolation of the word malach in one or more places in these stories. And you can check out this chapter in my open access book, Adonai's Divine Images, for a more full discussion. And then one of the peer-reviewed papers coming out in an edited volume next year that I'm publishing also discusses in even more detail what's going on with this textual interpolation.
It's almost as if the biblical author was trying to show that God was existing as multiple persons, all with the same names, attributes, their actions, the way they speak about themselves, all identical to only the attributes and character of God.
And if you only bothered to finish that sentence in Exodus 23, you would see the explanation for how this can be. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Trinity, because the concept of the Trinity, the conceptual framework, package, constellation of the Trinity simply did not exist yet. It would not be developed until beginning in its most inchoate form in the 2nd century CE.
So the next time an anti-Trinitarian tells you that there is no evidence for the Trinity in the Bible and that it was made up at the Council of Nicaea 300 years later, pull this out. Don't quiver in your boots, lace them up, and show them the angel of the Lord.
Well, it wasn't invented at the Council of Nicaea. It was formalized, and the particular formula that we understand as the Trinity ever since 325 CE was originally articulated for the first and the most authoritative time at the Council of Nicaea, but the concept started developing in the 2nd century CE. And it is not anywhere in the Bible, not the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament. All those texts had been completed by the time the notion of 3 different persons occupying the one being of the God of Israel began to develop in a way that is recognizable as the Trinity. That's entirely post-biblical. And the fit for this video has been my University of Oxford windbreaker.